I'd like to confirm that all of you are in the right place. We are here for the session on Havana, a paradigm of a Caribbean city. If you are here for that session, we'd like to invite you to sign in for AIA continuing education credits or AICP credits, which would be available to you if you sign up at the desk that's located here at the left of the room. I should announce before that we begin today that we had scheduled a speaker from Havana, Eduardo Luis Rodriguez, a well-renowned historian, who unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, was unable to make it to the United States. So we are, on the other hand, quite fortunate to have with us this afternoon Professor Isabel Rigol, a Cuban historian as well, who was the director of the Centro de Estudios for Restoration and Conservation and Museum Conservation in the city of Havana. She's been a faculty member at the School of Architecture for many years now, and has also in recent decades been involved directly with UNESCO's efforts to identify World Heritage Sites. And so she is a consultant to UNESCO on different projects that they have throughout the Caribbean basin. Professor Rigol and I sort of tried to figure out best we could how to cover the material that otherwise would have been covered by Eduardo Luis in between us. And so she will be doing a historical introduction today to the architecture and a focus, of course, on the history of urbanism on the island of Cuba and its many layers. And I will follow up with a focus on the form-based codes that were developed as of the year 2004 and instituted in Havana for a very particular neighborhood of the name El Vedado. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Professor Rigol to start us off.
Hello, everybody. Please, I apologize for my English, and perhaps you will find that I have committed many mistakes on the words I've written on my PowerPoint, so that's why I apologize. Well, Havana, as many scholars and lots of people have said, is a paradigm within the Caribbean. Sorry to say this because I am from Havana. I was born in Havana, but it seems that it is true. And there's not such a city within the whole Caribbean. This is due to many historical facts, to the geographical location of the island of Cuba, within a crossroads between the old and the new worlds, between north and south. So these facts have a lot to do with the development of our capital city. It was founded in 1514 on the south coast. Then it had a second settlement and a third in 1519 by the Bay of Carenas on the north coast of the island. When the Spaniards found this wonderful bay, which happened to be quite protected and had a natural channel which was part of that protection. So then they decided to settle there. Very soon, after 1560s, the Spanish crown decided to turn Havana into the encounter point of the whole Spanish fleet. You all know that Spain at those times had many enemies, and there were many pirates and buccaneers in the Caribbean, which was the arena of all the conflicts related to Spain. On the other hand, the Spanish vessels traveled from the Caribbean to Spain full of gold and silver, so we can all figure out how it was. So the Spaniards had to find a way to protect these vessels, and then Havana was turned into the counterpoint of these vessels, and each one had to wait for the others. Sometimes they had to wait for months, and this had a lot to do with the development of the town. At the beginning, yes, the primitive layout was an irregular grid, but there was already an attempt of adaptation to climatic conditions, as well as some idea of how to manage urban growth. Of course, the location of the main plaza and of the relevant buildings was established. These are old maps of how this primitive village was, with the La Fuerza fortress, which was the second one, because the first had been destroyed in 1555 by a famous corsair. Well, the laws of the Indies from 1573 consolidated the experience regarding town planning, especially the Plaza Mayor and the checkboard grid so common to Latin American urbanism. But the first known ordinances, I don't know if that's the proper word, if not, please correct me, were those that were worked out by Alonso de Cáceres, a man that had been appointed by the governor of Santo Domingo, Nicolás de Obando, for this task. The Cáceres ordinances established, among various regulations related to justice, land ownership, and other communal affairs, others regarding order and hygiene of the urban space and buildings, as well as the need for construction permits. For the first time, construction permits did exist. There was, at the beginning of the 17th century, a plan, it's considered the first master plan for Havana, that was elaborated by Cristobal de Rodas, a military engineer. At those times, the streets were not precisely regularly drafted, blocks were not regular either, as demanded by Philip II's ordinance and by the Cáceres ordinance. The grid was composed by narrow streets that were adequate for a hot climate. Lots were deep and elongated on that primitive central area. Also irregular were a few humble quarters on the south area of the city core. During the first stages of colonization, let's say 16th and part of 17th century, convents, as Santa Clara convent, were among the most relevant constructions in the 16th century. It's interesting, the photograph on your right is part of Santa Clara convent that was built in 1632, but apparently part of the convent, of the second cloister of the convent, was a group of houses that previously existed on that place, and then the convent surrounded this group of houses. So when you see it now, you might have an idea of how the earliest urbanism was, with those very, very narrow streets, balconies, and so. This is another part of Santa Clara convent. The old name is the Street of Bitterness, Calle de la Amargura. And there's a legend. They say that it was a sailor who gave these houses to the nuns in order for his daughter to be admitted at the convent. Well, these are the oldest houses and buildings. And it's very important to note that the fortifications, the impressive, very impressive fortifications built since the 16th century, were the result of a need for defense and had a great influence on the urban form and townscape. This is the Royal Force Castle, which was designed under Italian Renaissance patterns. Later on, the Morro Fortress and La Punta Fortress, together with some other minor ones, were built. The construction started at the end of the 16th century, 16th century, and ended in the 17th. The city walls were started in 1640. The 18th century was a stage of enlightenment, basically due to the prosperity of the colony, due to the production of sugar and other products. During the government of the Marquis de la Torre, who apparently was an enlightened man, engineer Antonio Fernandez Trevejos remodeled the former Square of Arms, which was the place of foundation where the militaries did their exercises. But Fernandez Trevejos turned this plaza into a civic center and installed there the monumental palace of the governors in 1776 and the post office, among the most important buildings. The two first promenades in Havana were then created. One, the Alameda de Paula, within the walled precinct, and the Elizabeth II promenade out of the city walls. This meant a first expansion towards the rural area and an announcement of the future direction of Havana's development in the 19th century. In 1762, there was a very transcendental event. The English attacked Havana and dominated it for 11 months. It seems that the Spaniards were so scattered because until that moment it was thought that Havana was a real stronghold and that nobody could enter the town, but the English did. So after they left, a new defensive system, more powerful than the previous ones, was built. They are La Cabaña Fortress on the top. Well, the three photographs are from La Cabaña. There are two other major fortresses like this and a group of smaller ones. These fortresses, I'm speaking about 1764-65, were built under French patterns, those of the Marquis de Vauban. And the plazas or squares that had been developing towards the 16th and 17th century had already matured. In the 18th century, for instance, this is the former Square of Arms with the Palace of the Governor and the Post Office building I mentioned before. This is Plaza Vieja, which happened to be the marketplace. This is Plaza de San Francisco, which had to do with the activities related to the harbor and to the convent of St. Francis. The Cathedral Square, which with a cathedral that is our most important Baroque monument, and Plaza del Cristo, which was just a stop on the processions, religious processions in the town. Well, at the end of the 18th century, Baroque architecture appeared. This is a very interesting example because it is not very Spanish-like. It is very Italian. And they say that this is because it was an Italian priest who built this cathedral. It resembles a small church in Rome named San Carlo alle Quattro Fontane. Of course, it's not like the Baroque in Guatemala or Mexico or Peru because there was no gold in Cuba at those times. So, and the stone was too smooth to be properly carved. But it is our most important Baroque monument. And these are some houses from those times. Already at the end of the 19th century, the galleries with colonnades appeared, and this is one of the most relevant characteristics of Havana. There's one essay written by Alejo de Carpentier, the famous Cuban writer that won the Cervantes Prize, one of the most important Latin American writers of all times. His essay is titled "The City of Columns." So this photograph shows you what the City of Columns really is. In 1817, there was a regulation in order to control what was happening out of the city walls by engineer Antonio María de la Torre, and they established a more rational pattern within the town with the calzadas, or very important roads, as borders. Between 1834 and 1838, Governor Miguel Tacón, who was, it's been said that he was a very cruel man, but he was megalomaniac. And he promoted a program of very relevant urban works as a new jail, markets. He remodeled many urban spaces, built a theater, and other than modern facilities which shaped the city in a more monumental way. Sorry. Tacón's works were really very important for the shape of the town. Governor Tacón and Count of Villanova were rivals. Tacón represented the Spanish crown, while Count of Villanova was a Creole, very wealthy man. And part of the symbols of this rivalry were that while Tacón put this fountain called the Fountain of Lions, in St. Francis Square, this other that was purchased and put on the Prado Avenue by the Count of Villanova represents an Indian woman. Of course, she is a very refined Indian. See that she has feathers on her head, and a shield with 3 castles, the 3 fortresses. At the same time, she has a basket with tropical fruits and is surrounded by dolphins. She's a very symbolic sculpture still in Havana. When the city walls were torn down around the 1860s, the Ring of Havana was created with elegant mansions and public buildings, hotels and theaters. Up to that moment, there were no hotels, no theaters, and it was then that they appeared. You see, these are some of them. This is the Inglaterra Hotel on the Prado Avenue. Also, the urban factories that were, in all cases, the cigar factories, quite related to Cuban history. These are some prints that have to do with a tradition of manufacturing cigars. Havana turned to be more monumental. The new regulations established different heights, and for instance, this is one of the palaces on the ring. You see that there were transformations on architecture, evidently. Also, railroad stations then appeared. Cuba had a railroad before Spain. It's a pity that now our railroad works awful. But the most relevant ordinances for Havana were those from 1861, approved under the sponsorship of Spanish Governor Francisco Serrano. Havana owes to these regulations many characteristics which defined its shape, as for instance the galleries and colonnades along the main streets and avenues, the continuity of heights, balconies, and parapets. I wrote the word in Spanish, but Sonia told me that that element is called parapet. Architecture was defined together with urbanism and the collective space with both senses of beauty and order. So that's why these ordinances were so important. This is Havana at the end of the 19th century. It turned into a monumental modern city at the end of the 19th century. The ordinances also would regulate the growth of the town to new areas and were applied to other towns beyond Havana. From the end of the 19th century until the 20th, new regulations and additions were approved, but basically keeping the principles and the spirit of those from 1861. Here you can see Havana and the new, old Havana here and all the expansion areas, and this is the area about which Sonia will speak to you very soon, Vedado. This was the project. I will not speak Vedado because she will speak about it. So this is just some photographs of that area, which she will explain more properly than I can do. El Cerro, Cerro means hill, was another area of expansion, and you see the characteristics of those mansions, which still exist, but now are very deteriorated. Well, with this, I will finish the Spanish era. The Republic started with many public works, for instance, the Malecón or seawall that was started in 1902 after the independence from Spain, and is a very important part of Havana. Also, about 1915, with new regulations that were based on the 1861 regulations, new developments took place. This is Miramar, to the west of old Havana and Vedado, which was a very luxurious area, and it developed with a spirit, also with a spirit not only of those regulations that came from the 19th century, but also some American influence can be seen on this avenue. For instance, I've always thought that it looks very much like St. Charles in New Orleans, only that there is not a streetcar in the middle. Probably because the urban planners and architects in Cuba at those times not only traveled to Europe, but many of them traveled very often to the United States, and many were trained at American universities. The Prado, and then from 1925 to 29, was remodeled by an urban planner and landscape designer. His name was Jean-Claude Nicolas Forestier, that was brought to Cuba by Carlos Miguel de Céspedes, who was the Minister of Public Works during Machado's presidence. Well, this is some photographs, very bad ones, of the Forestier plan. Forestier also made a very important contribution to the urban form of Havana. Many of the monumental characteristics of Havana, like the Prado Avenue, are due to Forestier, only that he also committed some mistakes. For instance, he was planning a street from the Prado Avenue to the harbor, which would have meant the destruction of a good amount of historic buildings. Fortunately, it didn't happen. So this is the Prado. The Prado from the Sevilla Hotel. Also, in the 20s, there's a good amount of new buildings under what we define as eclecticism were built in Havana, especially those dedicated to banking. There's a collection of buildings for banks which is a magnificent one. You find buildings that were for the Bank of Nova Scotia, Bank of Canada, Chase Manhattan, Trust Company, and others. These are some mansions from those early decades from the 20th century. And for instance, this is the Nacional Hotel on the Vedado district from 1930 that was designed by McKim, Mead, and White. Well, Miramar, as I told you, was an area that followed very strict regulations, and the results were really beautiful, as I told you before. And not only in the urban terms, the architecture of Miramar was really beautiful. Also in the 30s, sorry, because there are some slides that are not in the right position. In the 30s, the Capitol building on the Prado Avenue was finished in 1929, a very monumental building. And then also in 1930, Art Deco started to appear. This is the Bacardi building, where the Bacardi headquarters were. Though there were additions to the old core, it didn't change too much. The Havana University, also from the 1920s and 30s, is another very important part of the town. And, well, I told you that Sonia will speak about Vedado, but I just wanted to show you some other example. This is the Lopez Serrano building, which shows the Art Deco influence in Havana. Out of Vedado and Miramar, the former country club area had beautiful mansions. This is the Pollock mansion. But while this kind of architecture was produced at the same time, this building was finished in 1930. A more modern architecture also appeared. This is from the 40s. This is Max Borges' house on First Avenue in Miramar, and this one is from 1947. The theater, its original name was, something is happening with this. I'm not, they are just running. Okay, so, well, in the 50s, there were regulations with regard to the height of the buildings, but then new regulations were issued allowing taller buildings, allowing high rise, and these are the tallest buildings in Havana nowadays. Do I still have some time? 5 minutes, okay. So, you see that on this avenue, Precedents Avenue, started to appear the tall buildings. I just want to remember that the plan from 1956 by José Luis Sert was a very modern plan, but would have meant the destruction of part of Old Havana, precisely of those characteristics that made Old Havana in 1982 a World Heritage Site. Of course, it is not to blame José Luis Sert. He was acting according to the most advanced trends at that moment. I don't think that either Cuban architects would have done anything better at that moment. So this is the Riviera building from the late 50s. A new master plan was approved in the 60s for Havana. It comprised a metropolitan park, which was not completed. Fortunately, the forests on that area have been preserved. Instead, 3 parks, the Lenin Park, the Botanical Park, and a new zoo were built somewhere on some areas rather far from the heart of the town. the university town, the schools of arts, and the East Havana neighborhood unit. The previous ones, I told you, were the most important, most relevant works from the revolutionary period. Then in the 70s, a very pragmatic attitude, technocratic, dominated, and ugly things like this, like the Alamar district, appeared. In the 90s, after the trade with the former socialist countries ended, there was some opening to tourism, and some areas that had been destined to a big metropolitan park were sacrificed in order to build these buildings, which are not too beautiful. And the Villa Panamericana, this is not, I didn't find any for a better photograph, but it's the only attempt in the last years to follow the traditional grid. These are some examples. I'll finish in a few seconds, Sonia, don't worry. This is a bank on Fifth Avenue. The ground floor is a bank by Eugenio Batista, and it got in 2002 an addition by Jose Antonio Choi, one of our most relevant architects. Right now, there are challenges like the harbor, which doesn't work anymore as a commercial harbor, but has magnificent buildings. Only one of them has been rehabilitated, but there are many projects. My School of Architecture has worked together with the Preservation Office for Old Havana on many of these very interesting projects. That's a real challenge. Another very important issue is the rehabilitation program for Old Havana, which has been working for about 25 years with some interesting experiences on dwellings for the population of Old Havana. The new regulations that started to be worked out some 10 years ago for Old Havana, Vedado, and the Malecon have been a wonderful achievement. I just want to thank Sonia, who has been one of the most active promoters of this very important work, which I hope will allow our beautiful town to preserve its values, to well define the limits of transformation. There has to be transformation, there has to be modernization, but there are limits. And I think that the regulations will precisely help to define these limits. The hope, well, a lot of training that is going on. The new generations, many thanks.
Good afternoon. My name is Sonia Chow. I'm a faculty member at the School of Architecture at the University of Miami and the director of our Center for Urban and Community Design. I should start this presentation by thanking the J.M. Kaplan Fund, who for many years sponsored an initiative in which I participated with other faculty members, some professionals that I see here in the audience today, the best part was that we had a 10-year relationship with scholars and professionals in Havana with whom we had opportunities for cross-pollination and growth and friendship, and together trying to envision a place that could grow in such a manner as would be respectful of its rich heritage. The presentation that I will that I have for you today is focused on the urban codes of the neighborhood that is known as El Vedado. Before I talk to you about El Vedado, I just want to summarize rather quickly where Isabel has sort of taken us so far. In the first slide, on the upper left, you'll see the historic, what we refer to today, of course, as the historic center, which was the initial settlement that was placed within the harbor. Its first ring of growth, which occurs, this is 16th century, the second image is the 17th century. The third image is the 18th century, where we can see that the city starts to expand out along rural roads that are known as calzadas, that would take you out to the very rich and fertile farmlands. And, of course, the 20th century is the last image here, where we can see that the city has truly grown exponentially. The larger image below is the 19th century, and I want to pause because I think that at this point there's an intersection between what is happening in the new suburbs, such as El Vedado, and what is already evidently occurring within the historic center, and that is a great sophistication and consolidation of the urban fabric, the appearance of important civic buildings that talk about the very rich heritage and social and intellectual activities that were already occurring at that time. There was, of course, waves of immigration, as Isabel mentioned in her presentation, and their reflections are seen in the architecture and in the urbanism. We see here in the map of 1838 the expansion of the city, and it may seem like a patchwork initially, and in fact it is a product of different developers who would develop their own tracts of land. But there is a kind of interesting seam that's created between them as these different grids are coming together along these important roads. I want to bring your attention to this area here, which is the area that today is known as El Vedado. The name El Vedado, of course, comes to us because in Spanish, Vedado means something that is prohibited. In this region, it was prohibited for there to be any construction because of the slope of the site from a very high point here at the castle of the prince that would lead you all the way down to the shoreline. This was a strategic location from which, a strategic military location from which, of course, you could see pirates from a great distance. And so therefore it was not allowed for there to be any construction in this area, and it was for many years dedicated solely to agricultural activities, surrounded by the forests in the area. Again, the city starts to expand, and you see that the ordinances that will accompany the growth of the city from its very early days, we know that the first ordinances, in fact, appear in 1574 as municipal ordinances. Before that, there had been what were referred to as royal decrees and dispositions. And these regulations are not focused only on architecture and urbanism, but rather on all aspects of life in the new settlements, which included political and social activities as well. So the first expansions of the city will eventually also be informed by ordinances that will arrive in 1855. These are ordinances that are, interestingly enough, going to benefit from research that had been done at the University of Madrid by the medical school faculty. And so from that, you will have regulations that, in fact, have certain dispositions that are focused on sanitary conditions and how to improve them within public spaces. These are images of an early image of how the grid of the city is going to meet the new neighborhood of El Vedado. Now, this image of El Vedado, which sort of is unintentionally there, is accompanied by a map of a work that Forestier had proposed later on in the 19th century, which in fact tried to heal some of those disconnections between these different grids and parts of the city, vis-a-vis grand boulevards and public spaces. This is a view of the city in the 20th century. in 1951, and I wanted to kind of pause there because between the time that Forestier introduced this grand plan and in fact his collaboration with Cuban architects and planners and artists led to that plan for beautification and growth of the city, and later revisions to codes that occurred or laws that were introduced in the 1950s, there are changes that are going to affect all of the growth of the city. And that is laws that changed the way that we look at property. Property for the first time could allow for rental properties. And so in the 1930s you'll have the appearance for the first time of apartment buildings. In the 1950s there will be a law decree in 1951 to be specific, and later in 1952 the law that then allowed for condominiums, which is known as the law of horizontal property. This too will end up changing the image of the city, as you can well see in the images on the right-hand side. And later on, a year later, they will actually regulate the height of these buildings in relationship to the type of street that they're sitting on. So, for example, the law established that on primary streets, buildings could be up to twice as tall as the street was wide. So all of these things are going to start to impose themselves on the way that the city itself grows. In the 1980s, there is a regulating plan that is introduced. It's called el Plan Regulador y Plan Director for Havana, and it's a plan that kind of starts to establish that the city should really be thought of as municipalities. It had grown so very much that the idea of having codes that would regulate all of the city in the same manner seemed inappropriate. So it was established that the municipalities would be subdivided into 15 different municipalities would be established. The interesting part about the Vedado is, of course, that it is declared a historic monument of national value in 1999, and it is since that time a protected site. But because of as you can see, the grid in El Vedado is such that it could accommodate larger scaled buildings versus the more compact city in the historic section of the town, that this area was in fact most vulnerable to development, as would be its adjacent partner, the Reparto Miramar, which is located to the left of El Vedado on the other side of the Almendares River. For this reason, there were codes that were being introduced that had to be revamped. For example, there were construction codes that looked at the ordinances that Isabel made mention of. The 1861 ordinances were updated in 1963, loosening some of the belts, if you will, that restricted building in the city, making it more easy for you to introduce, for example, alien kind of typologies. There was later on in 1984 the general regulations for Central Havana, which I think is a very interesting attempt on the part of planners at that time to think about how to communicate to the citizenry, and that's what this that you see here is actually a pamphlet that was handed out to the citizenry, making it clear to them what their rights were and what their responsibilities were when trying to build within the fabric of this specific municipality, using graphic standards, as you can see, to communicate those criteria. So here we have a current view of the province, if you will, of Havana, and you can clearly understand that it is expansive. That was a kind of very brief summary across the history, the trajectory of urban codes for the overall city of Havana. And so I'm going to introduce you now to the neighborhood of El Vedado rather quickly before I talk to you about the codes. For those of you that don't know El Vedado, it was a neighborhood that, as I mentioned before, was originally agricultural land. And in 1858, two property owners get together. One of them was actually interested in promoting streetcar transportation systems. And so he and the largest landowner of the area decided to apply for the construction of a new town. Their application, which was accompanied by a simple drawing that delineated the limits of the property that was adjacent to the Almendares River, did not have any layout to it. So it was simply demarcating the limits of the property that would be utilized for this new town. A year later, though, there was a submittal, a formal submittal that was produced at that time by a Spanish civil engineer by the name of Luis Ibolión Bosque. And the project that he came up with, and this is what the area looks like, so you can see that it's clearly a suburb to the city. It was thought of initially as a resort area, actually, for the city of Havana by the water. And so the development of this original plan, which was for this area that you see on the left, known as El Carmelo, was disposed at 45 degrees to true north. So interestingly enough, it's not continuing the grid of the city, right? It's not an informal pattern, but rather a pattern that is very rigid. In fact, there were 105 blocks that were 100 by 100 meters in dimension. Its parcels, as you can see, were broken down into a swastika pattern, with the four corner sites being slightly larger than the interior sites. The corner sites were, in fact, approximately 22 by 50 meters, and the interior sites were 13 by 50 meters. What was established at this time was that each one of these parcels would be broken down in a very regimented manner. There was the requirement of a 5-meter front garden. There was a requirement of a 4-meter deep porch. There was a requirement that that porch, in fact, be a minimum of 2/3 of the facade, and that there would be a limit of only 3 stories in the neighborhood. There were primary streets that were identified and secondary streets that were identified. The first one being the Paseo, and a cross street which was known as Línea, which was the street off of which, of course, the line, Línea, of the streetcar would come down across. And so, in some sense, you have a kind of Roman patterning emerging here. And what is also interesting about the plan is that there is a kind of interest in creating public space. So 10 blocks were set aside, here you see examples of how those were to be disposed, for public use: schools, churches, parks, hospitals, etc. These are drawings that were produced later on, but it gives you a general idea of how those codes were to be very strictly interpreted, and what those limitations were. Of course, this is later, but this is the typical section here of a building in El Vedado. These are typical street sections with an overall dimension of approximately 86 feet that could be divided with what they refer to as a parterre, or without the parterre and a wider sidewalk, and also, as you can see, a wider street. Now, the plan that Ibolión submitted was, of course, initially in 1859, and then in 1860 he designed an expansion to the town. The expansion would continue this grid over to the adjacent property and establish another primary street that would be perpendicular to the waterfront, and another primary street that would be running across, that was La Calzada. These neighborhoods over time would expand yet again, about 20 years later, into the property of adjacent owners known as Medina. It is noteworthy that Ivo León's plan predates the Garden City proposals that were formulated by Ebenezer Howard. It's also interesting to note that the boulevards here that we see may have in fact had some knowledge of the activities of housemen in Paris that were occurring at around the same time, and the plan by Cerdá of 1859, which was emitted the same year as the initial plan for El Vedado. The codes of 1861, it's not quite sure which came first, the chicken or the egg, because the codes disposed in such a manner that it coincides with the plan that Ivo León had. So we're not sure what kind of conversations may have transpired. Historians haven't quite figured that out yet, but there may have been some cross-pollination there as well. Here we have a plan of 1899 showing you that over 30 blocks had been occupied by the time that the Spanish rule ends and the Americans arrive. And here you have a kind of image of what that original character was like. In fact, there were wood frame constructions that are quite different from the general character that evolved later on once the ordinances accompanied the plan and a more formal approach developed and a more legible urban fabric resulted. Here we see a typical residential street. We can see the street section, the parterre, the sidewalk, the garden, the required garden wall, by the way, and the very deep porch. This is, of course, a map of Cuba today. So we can see how that city is quite dense. But we can also see that it has, in fact, suffered morphological and typological intrusions onto the image of the city, which have resulted either because of insensitive insertions from economic interests, such as hotel developments, or ad hoc additions to the city that have been a consequence of economic situations at the level of the local community. As I mentioned before, we had an opportunity to collaborate with scholars, and the result of that was the Vedado charrette that was held in May of 2000 and 2003. And from that 7-day charrette, what was the result of it was an analysis of what were the elements that in fact defined the character of the city and what were the things that needed to be preserved in order to guide future growth. Recognizing the importance of the urban assemblage and the preservation of its public spaces, and again kind of remembering the rights and responsibilities of citizens in making these things happen. The conceptual objectives were around the preservation of the image of the city, and that had to do with everything from understanding that you needed to preserve the urban grid of the city, the dimensions of the blocks, the configuration of those parcels, the historic way in which not more than 1/6 of the block would be used up by one building. That was actually a heated debate that occurred during this whole process, but one that eventually was argued and won, and that I think will make a very big difference in the future development of the city. Maintaining the public green, which is of course essential, and the architectural elements and height restrictions. These are some of the drawings that were produced in this during the charrette, and this drawing here in particular starts to look at the intensity of uses that are in the area, as well as the areas that are more preserved than others. This drawing identifying for us where were the street frontages that of course had paradigmatic examples of architectural and urban conditions. A master plan was produced as a kind of way of indicating how the waterfront edge could be thought or revisioned. And then, more importantly, the strategy of thinking about the code that would come as a way of trying to understand the city in terms of intensities. Again, returning to this idea that if you had an area that we wanted to preserve, that then there would be very little intervention in that part of the town, and that would mean that it would behoove us to ensure that the codes placed enough restrictions on development of land in those areas so that it would not be of interest of anyone to destroy a building in order to redevelop it anew. But rather, the proposal was always to look at ways in which wherever you were building within the city, you were always trying to reinforce the image of that city by learning what those elements were that gave it its character. This included understanding where those assets, those historic assets were, and how to protect them. And this was a very important drawing in the process because whereas some argued that the city needed to allow for greater footprints throughout, this drawing illustrated very clearly that in fact there were only very few examples within the city where you had the larger footprints that had intruded upon the fabric of the city, making it very evident that in fact newer buildings, which is to say the taller buildings, could very well resolve their uses within that smaller footprint. This was the resulting map that was created, or plan that was created. The central area, which was known as la medulla, the marrow, if you will, of the community, is the area that had the greatest preservation and thus would have the most strict kind of imposition of how to intervene in the area. And then that was surrounded by the medium intensity, and at the perimeter where already there had been transformations, both in morphologically and architecturally, typologically, the perimeter would then be allowed to develop at a greater intensity. These are drawings that illustrate the many different ways in which the codes were being debated, how they could be disposed, and in the end it was decided that there would be 3 sections to the plan, one that had general regulations, one that had what were known as specific regulations for each one of the 3 zones, and then finally one that was for special circumstances that had to do with particular moments in the fabric of the city that needed addressing. The final drawing that was produced post-Charette of that master plan, and the idea that given the economy and the need to kind of also improve the public spaces, that new developments within the city would have 2 responsibilities in that 3rd zone. The code placed emphasis not only on preservation but also on sustainability. And so it took on, in its description of how to create new buildings in this new zone, partnerships that could be created between the public and private sectors so that property owners that were being given opportunities to build, in fact, in that more desirable waterfront location would have the responsibility of co-developing, if you will, public spaces that were adjacent to their property, thus benefiting themselves but the community as well. As you can see, most of the waterfront is in fact left towards open as public parks, and very few buildings were introduced to it. The codes were divided up into 9 principal sections and an annex that, as you can see, had a section at the very beginning that had to do with sustainability and how to promote sustainability, and the second one was the protection of the historic fabric of the city. The third, each one of these sections then had to do with how to do that, the structure of the block, the structure of the parcel, the structure, how buildings needed to align themselves, and the elements of facade going on through the list until reaching down to the very basic elements of the architecture. We had diagrams in the 8th section that you can see here that also talked about uses and where they were preferred, permissible, or prohibited. Series of different plans that illustrated things, everything from flood zones, to locations of public amenities, to preservation, degrees of preservation, to where you had existing commercial centers, and where those could bisect and enrich the new proposal for the intensity plan. The general strategy, as I mentioned before, had to do with the integral rehabilitation of the urban and architectural realms, understanding the urban grid and its block as fundamental components, and that collectively assembled, they defined the image of El Vedado. The strategy also wanted to orient investments towards rehabilitation initiatives, the insertion of sympathetic new constructions focused on reinforcing the image of the city, avoiding projects which are foreign to its identity and culture. The workshop determined, and the codes later on ensured, that taller structures should be located on the wide avenues, locating them along the Malecón and in the downtown areas where the significant alterations had already transpired, and that tourism-oriented activities should respect the preservation of the built patrimony, the environmental resources, and the social structure of the neighborhood. Sustainability features dealt with everything from how to deal with gray water, how to deal with alternative energies, but also the requirement of passive systems that had so well accompanied the architecture before the advent of air conditioning. Preservation was, of course, the fundamental backbone of this code, and it made clear that all construction action had to be undertaken within the historic district in such a way as to reach the objectives of conservation and protection of the urban assemblage of El Vedado, respecting the 4 levels of preservation that had been already identified by the Office of the Historian and other divisions within the city that have to do with preservation and conservation. I've already spoken briefly about this idea of the cooperative development. And these are just examples of how the code illustrated for you everything from the block to the occupation to buildability, the front garden elements, front porches, the side and back corridors, how the basements, parking, overhangs, balconies, all of these elements would be defined, even in the very tall structures. Here you have on the left, on the right-hand side, illustration of how a corner building could be disposed, requiring, all of them, by the way, always requiring the setbacks, so that the 3-story setback that was part of the historic fabric would be employed both in all 3 zones. In the second medium zone, you'd have a setback at the 3rd story, and then in the 3rd zone, you'd have a setback both at the 3rd story and at the 8th story, as the limits of these areas changed. Of course, the lowest density had height limits of up to 3 stories. The medium density had limitations of between 5 and 8 stories, and then the highest density or intensity of use area would allow up to 25 stories. The codes would look at everything from the way in which a property owner would rehabilitate a property to new insertions that might be introduced by locals or others, and also looked at how public roads should be protected and not infringed upon by the uses that sometimes had in fact violated public space. These are all examples of typical conditions. The graphics, of course, make it very easy for anyone to use the codes. This was a first, of course, in the codes in the city, because historically the codes were seen more as legal documents intended for legal legalese and not necessarily for the common lay person. And finally, a table that kind of summarized all of the mandates. So, I think that that's the end of my presentation. And so if there are any questions at this time for either Isabel or for myself, we'd be happy to take them. Yes?
That feature towards the bottom left of Vedado, is that a cemetery?
Yes, it is. It's actually known as the Cemetery of Colón. Very interesting because it is disposed on a true north axis with Cardo and Decomano, divided up into 4 neighborhoods, if you will, and each one of those neighborhoods has its own center or central square, if you will. So it's actually a beautiful place to visit in the city.
Do the regulations address any preservation of the cemetery itself?
They do not. There are other entities that have jurisdiction over the cemetery. Yes?
So are these adapted, these regulations?
I'm sorry?
Are these adapted?
Yes, they were. I didn't use that that slide, but there is within the code, which is here, they actually incorporated the 2004 approval by the municipality's government, in which the code was formally accepted and incorporated. I should say that the Institute for Planning in Cuba, seeing the experience that the scholars had had, and the professionals and the institutions, which was a beautiful experience, I have to say, because all of these institutions were collaborating with each other. They weren't kind of in separate silos. There were no kind of turf wars. It was a wonderful kind of way of seeing how people could collaborate together for the common good. And so the Institute for Planning, seeing the benefits of that and seeing that the Office of the Historian had already decided to incorporate the same pattern or methodology in the creation of codes for both the traditional segment of the Malecón, which is in the front of the Centro Havana, and also the historic center itself. The planning division then decided that they too wanted to employ this and mandated that it be used as the model, the national model for codes from that point forward. So since that time it's been used in Cienfuegos, in Trinidad, and as I understand it, it's expected to, they're expecting to have a charrette sometime at the end of this year for Santiago de Cuba.
So is there actually development going on there? And if so, who's doing it?
There is development. A lot of the development at this time has to do with either partnerships with the government. Well, there are always partnerships with the government. Well, because of the way that land is disposed. Up until very recently, if you're following the changes in property ownership and rights, until very recently, of course, the government owned all land, and so property owners leased the building that they were sited on. And so there were partnerships. It's not unlike situations that occur in other countries, for example, in Asia. But what you have is, as I mentioned, the codes were also intended to guide informal or the general public's interest in rehabilitating their own house and how to guide that so that it wouldn't have, as you saw in some of the images that we both illustrated, no real guidance that then resulted in very insensitive interventions that do damage the image of the city when you have, for example, projections out onto the front garden or the closure of some of the porches and other additions to the city. Anyone else? I have to say that the codes were intended there's a consciousness of this kind of particular moment in the history of the country, and there has been a progression of codes. Back in '98, the municipality of Vedado actually looked at rethinking their codes for their district, and so this was another addition to that led to something very concrete. Concrete not only for the Vedado, as codes for the Vedado, but as something that then was thought of as useful in modeling growth within the country. And the reason that I think that was done is because, in fact, this code did not try to import any type of foreign kind of vision, but rather learned from this wonderful history of codes that was in place. There were centuries, really, of different ordinances that had governed the evolution of urban form. And so by going back and looking at what that trajectory was and understanding how those codes had given form to the city and grafting that and using that, it made perfect sense for you to continue to use that knowledge and way of building a place as you projected towards the future, with adaptations that allowed us to introduce perhaps new uses into the city that the 21st century might find necessary, but in such a way as to be absolutely respectful of that rich urban fabric that exists.
So did this, I take it, this is like a separate municipality from Havana?
As I said at the beginning, Havana had been divided up into 15 municipalities. You saw that very large map. And so this code has applied to El Vedado. Just like it, there's another one for the historic center, and just like it, there's another one for the centro, the historic traditional malecón. And what they're trying to do is to go through each neighborhood, but it is a kind of long and lengthy process. This process, for example, because of its, I think, thoughtfulness and because of the interaction between all of the institutions, was a 3-year-long process.
So do they have to get federal government's approval of their plan? Like when this municipality decides what they want to do, they adopt this plan, do they have to ask permission from the federal government?
Well, the jurisdiction that was given to them in the 1976, they were given, each municipality was given jurisdiction over its municipality, which means it was given the independence to decide for its municipality how it would be developed, and not only with regards to the urban and architectural realm, but also with social political agendas that might also be needed for that municipality. So they're independent to some degree, but Isabel has a comment as well.
Yes, they are independent to a certain extent, because there are some areas, some avenues on that Vedado district which have been listed as national landmarks. For instance, Paseo Avenue and Precedents Avenue. So the municipality alone cannot decide on what to do and what not to do.
Right.
So that's something that is for all the country, that the National Committee on Landmarks has this jurisdiction over the areas that have been listed as landmarks. The problem is that the entities that are supposedly dedicated to control and to give all the orientation to the municipalities are very weak currently, because the physical planning institute and the physical planning entities on each province and in the municipalities decayed quite a lot in the last years. There's a current process in order to reinforce their capacities in order to for the projections, and also with regard to control and orientation but it's a process that will take time. The regulations are perfect, and I really appreciate the huge effort that has been done. But my concern is how to strictly implement them. It has started, at least. The process has started. But as Sonia very well pointed out, it will take time. I'm not too worried about Old Havana, because Old Havana has a very powerful administration and a very charismatic person leading that process. But for the rest of the city of Havana, it might be difficult, and well, I insist that unfortunately it will take time. I just cross my fingers in order for this process to be positive and successful.
Are there any other questions? If not, thank you so much for your attendance today. We appreciate it.